Hello, welcome to the SunoikisisDC Spring 2025 session 8. Today we're going to be talking about text alignment. This is actually 7th in the series recorded so far, today on the 13th of March. So today's session will introduce the topic of text alignment, particularly focusing on the use of alignment to explore unknown texts or languages. There's a link to the GitHub page with all of the information for this session, so the slides and the bibliography and details about the exercise below the video on YouTube. So hello to everybody watching now live. Hello also to everybody joining us later. So today we have Megan Bushnell from the Oxford Text Archive, Chiara Palladino from Furman University, and Farnoosh Shamsian from the University of Leipzig joining us to discuss text alignment. If you're watching live, do say hello in the chat, tell us where you're watching from, and do ask any questions in the chat for discussion at the end. Great, so now I'm going to hand over to Chiara, who's going to start us off with a theoretical introduction to translation and text alignment.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Welcome to this session. It is my honor and my task to introduce the topic, and then I will leave the stage to Megan and Farnoosh to introduce some interesting case studies on text and translation alignment. So today's session is around this idea of text alignment. So I will try and explain to the best of my ability what that is and what it can be used for in the study of texts. This is SunoikisisDC digital classics, so particularly classical and ancient texts. So what is text alignment and what is it used for? First of all, text alignment is a task that starts from computer science. It's not originally a humanistic task. It is one of the main operations recognized under the bigger umbrella of what we call parallel text processing. And basically what that means is parallel texts or parallel corpora or texts placed alongside one right after the other, which can be in the same language. And this is what you typically do if you want to discover variants across different versions of the same text or in different languages. And so these would be instances of translations of one text. In the second case, we talk about translation alignment more precisely. In the former case, we talk about general text alignment or text processing. And typically we talk about parallel text if we talk about small collections, and parallel corpora if we talk about larger collections of parallel texts. So typically examples of large parallel corpora could be, for example, the Bible corpus, which contains a whole lot of unique translations in many different languages, or subtitles, for example, are a genre of parallel corpora. Different translations of the same text. Even text reuse, to a certain extent, can be considered an example of a parallel corpus. So when we talk about the task of text alignment, more precisely, we're really talking about comparison. Text alignment is defined as the comparison of two or more texts, and generally the purpose is that to find equivalences between different text units. We talk about general text alignment when we align text in the same language, and translation alignment, as I said, when the objective is to compare texts in different languages. Generally, we talk about alignment units depending on how granular we want this comparison to be. So we can align text at the document level, we can align text chunks, such as chapter or paragraphs, or even poetry lines. We can align sentences, or at the maximum granular level, we can align word by word. And generally, the output of the alignment is pairs or unit pairs. When we talk about translation alignment, we typically talk about translation pairs. And translation pairs can be of different varieties, depending on the sort of linguistic relationship between the text that we are analyzing. Typically, we expect a translation pair to be one-to-one. So one document to one document, one text chunk to one text chunk, one word to one word. But given the complexities of this task, this is rarely the case. we more typically have correspondences like one-to-many. One word in the original text will correspond to multiple words in the target text. We can have the opposite, many-to-one. We can have even many-to-many, so phrase to phrase or multiple words to multiple words. And that, of course, depends on the different cases. It depends on the linguistic and cultural relationship between the text. So because of these inner complexities, I probably don't have to tell you that text and translation alignment are very complex tasks. And they are also particularly difficult when we are in the domain of the so-called low-resource languages, pre-modern languages, indigenous languages, and so on, where not only there is a limited NLP infrastructure for automatized tasks, but it is also sometimes difficult to verify the information against existing evidence. In the case of classical languages, we talk about mostly dead languages where we cannot actually verify what the original intent of the author was. There are also other challenges that are kind of common to the whole task of text translation alignment. For example, languages typically encode sense and meaning with different orders of words. And sometimes this is a challenging task for machines to address. Obviously, from the cultural point of view, you will almost never have a perfect equivalence between single chunks or single tokens. In fact, we generally talk about cases where the equivalence is perfect or complete, but also we envision cases of partial possible equivalence or no equivalence at all, or no alignment. There are also particular complexities when it comes to creating alignments out of literary or poetical texts, which are mostly the case in classical or pre-modern texts, where the cultural and linguistic context can create misalignments or mistranslations even. There are cases where allusions, stylistic peculiarities, wordplays are very, very difficult to render in a different language. And so really, especially when we talk about translation alignment, this is a cultural operation in itself. It requires a dialogue, almost a continuous comparison and a continuous contrast between different languages, but also different cultures. And in and of itself, really, it reflects the challenges of translation in a lot of ways. And those of you who have a bit more of a background into translation studies will also know that sometimes that oftentimes it is impossible to create or to achieve what we would call a perfect translation. There's no such thing as a perfect equivalence across languages and across texts. And so the discipline of descriptive translation studies, as Megan will talk about in a minute, has defined the sort of idea of acceptability and adequacy in establishing the equivalence across languages and across texts. For example, Gideon Toury, who has essentially defined the field of descriptive translation studies, has assessed different criterias to indicate what constitutes equivalence across cultural domains and across textual domains in different languages. And equivalence is sort of a compromise between different things, right? Acceptability, first of all, so how well a text can meet the cultural standards of the target language. And this is generally more towards the idea of paraphrase and adaptation. Adequacy, how accurately a text can convey the language and the cultural importance of the source. And this can be more towards the lines of literal translation. And equivalence is really a balance between all of these things, right? The source language, the target language, but also the culture that the text, that the original text is meant to address, and the audience that the original text is meant to address. So translation alignment, in a way, as a computational task, can be used to sort of reverse engineer this process of the translation, the translator intentions, and its relationship with the original text. So in terms of text alignment and translation alignment, obviously, this is a task that can be done in different ways. It can be done manually. Of course, and there are several pros to that. You can decide exactly how to establish translation equivalence, but of course, it is very laborious and very time consuming, and it's not great for large parallel corpora. It can be done automatically. It is generally in computer science a task that is done automatically, but of course, it is not as flexible. It does not support all languages, and this is particularly important in our case, and it will not achieve the same level of accuracy and precision that you would have if you were to do this task manually. So in the specific domain of digital classics and pre-modern text studies, there are several projects and programs that have been designed for text alignment, and particularly, but not exclusively, for translation alignment. AntConc is a program designed more specifically for sentence alignment and for text chunk alignment. Alpheos, the Alpheos project, has their own standalone text alignment environment. And then I'm going to introduce the Ugarit editor and the Ugarit automatic translation alignment tool in the next few minutes. So there is a ton of different other tools, but I want to focus on specifically those that have been designed for the particular task of alignment in pre-modern texts. So Ugarit is a tool, a crowdsourcing web application that was born in 2016, specifically designed for the manual translation alignment of ancient and low resource languages. And the Ugarit project has grown exponentially since then. As you can see from this slide, it embraces several languages, several thousands of texts, and we are currently well beyond the number of users that you can see right there. It's probably around 800 users at this point and close to 1 million translation pairs. And the Ugarit project is currently supporting several other projects that use text and translation alignment for different purposes. So there are different team members, different project applications that Ugarit supports at the moment. So originally, Ugarit was designed with a pretty limited goal to collect training data to train automatic translation alignment models. But eventually it grew into several different things. And at the moment, the alignment editor supports the carefully thought and carefully designed manual alignment and publication of parallel texts on the web. And it can also be used as a reading environment and as a language learning tool. So in the next few minutes, I will give you a very quick overview of how you can use the alignment editor to align, to read, to compare documents in different languages. And I will illustrate very briefly some of the things that it can be used for. And I should also mention that after 2016, Ugarit also has expanded into the domain of automatic translation alignment. So today I'm going to mostly cover the alignment editor for manual alignment, but if you want to check out the current feature of the transformer-based automatic alignment model, I have provided a QR code and an address to the demo that we have. And if you're a bit more computer savvy, you can also test the automatic alignment model by downloading it from Hugging Face. So this can help you understand how automatic alignment can work and how it can serve your project if you're dealing with large amounts of text. And we can be we would be very happy to process the text for you if you're thinking about a particular project application. So in order to use Ugarit, you will need a profile. You will need to join with a specific account with your name and your email. You don't have to have an organization. And after you log in, you are going to be able to create your project, your translation alignment project, and to publish it on the web, should you desire to do so. So once you get here on the homepage and you are logged in, you can click on the translation alignment editor menu. And you can choose between an alignment that is bilingual, so you can use two languages into two texts into different languages, but you can also decide to do a trilingual alignment if you, for example, are investigating different couples of translations, or if you're investigating texts in multiple languages. And this tool functions with a pretty easy copy-paste mechanism. So what you really have to do is have your text in a TXT format. You can just copy it and paste it into the different sections, into the different sections of the editor. And as a plea, please select the correct languages so that we can correctly display them in the homepage. It is advisable and it is best practices to provide some metadata in the editor. So after you have clicked on aligned, it will bring you here and it will compel you to indicate some basic metadata about your text, particularly the title. And you can also select whether you want your alignments to be publicly visible or not. Then after that, it is just a matter of individuating the different equivalences between your two texts. And the way you do that is by simply clicking on the tokens or words that you want to align. You can align one word to one word, or you can decide to select multiple words at the same time. And the tool is going to automatically save your translation pairs, which will appear gradually in the column that you see right here on the right as you click through the text. Very importantly, at the end, you need to click on the blue button to save your changes so that all of the translation pairs are saved and then they can be visualized in your profile and publicly. Once you are done, if you have selected the yes option to make your translation alignment visible, it is also going to appear in the homepage. And this is the way in which it appears. It can be shared through a link, and it can be further explored through the public page of the alignments. And as you can see, there are a couple of nice things that you can have once you publish it on the platform. For example, Ugarit offers automatic transliteration. You can click on each word and highlight the corresponding aligned word if one exists. You can visualize at a glance the tokens that have been aligned, which are in blue, and the tokens that have not been aligned, which are in red. And you can also get a sense of the percentage of the tokens that have been aligned or not through the percentage bar below the text. You can also investigate and use the translation further in various ways that the platform makes available to you. So for example, you can embed the text in a different website. You can explore and download the translation pairs in CSV format, so in a simple table format, by clicking on Show Translation Pairs and clicking on Download in the little window, in the pop-up window that appears after. And this is particularly useful if you want to do things with those translation pairs after. And Ugarit also allows you to have some basic alignment statistics about the link types that you have established. So the things that I was talking about before, word to word, word to phrase, and so on and so forth. By clicking on one of the words that you have aligned, Ugarit will also will also make you available what we call an integrated dynamic lexicon. So basically, you're going to be able to fetch all the translation equivalents that have been established for that particular word across the Ugarit database in every single language that we have. So for example, the word basileus has been aligned by other users with other words in other languages. And you're able to see that through a simple language by language visualization or through what we call a radial cluster dendrogram, which is a tree view, as you can see on the right. So what can you do with translation alignment once you have done all of these wonderful things and you have established your parallel texts, your word by word aligned texts? There are a few different applications that utilize parallel corpora and aligned corpora for different types of tasks. I will not spend a lot of time talking about this because today we want to focus on one specific side of those applications. I will just very quickly illustrate some of those things. Typically, you can use aligned text to integrate in reading environments. So for example, the Beyond Translation Project is one of our partners where you can see and visualize aligned versions of ancient texts against English, German, and Persian translations. The Alpheus project also does the same with added information about grammar and vocabulary. But you can also use translation alignment for something else. There are several different tasks, downstream tasks that use aligned text. For example, we have used the Ugarit corpus to implement a named entity recognition model. Other people have used it for word sense disambiguation. You can, of course, create independent vocabularies and dynamic lexica. But more importantly, you can use translation alignment to improve your learning abilities when you're facing a language or a text that you do not know so well. Because really, when you perform manual or even partially automatic translation alignment, we have found that this can stimulate a more active and a more reflective engagement with the vocabulary, the cultural background of the text, and the linguistic specificities through this sort of systematic analytical comparison between different languages and different texts. So this is actually what my colleagues are going to talk about, how you use translation alignment for improving your ways of learning languages that you do not know. And I want to leave the stage to my colleague at this point, Farnoosh Shamsian, who is going to illustrate the first application a bit more in depth, and then Megan is going to continue along the same line. So Farnoosh, the stage is yours.
Yeah, thank you. So although today I want to talk about using translation alignment for learning purposes, I just want to quickly give an example of another use of translation alignment for a different project, which involved annotating named entities in a trilingual inscription, a third century inscription of Shapur, which is in Greek, Parthian, and Middle Persian. And we used a Ugarit to prepare the data that we would need for this purpose. So the first step was to align all the text that we have of this inscription as a trilingual alignment, which you see an example in this slide, and then extract the pairs from Ugarit and preserve the line number, and then mark the named entities. So we couldn't do an automatic annotation of these named entities because the two of the languages, the Iranian languages, Parthian and Middle Persian, involved in this project or don't have much resources for this. And I want to also point out to the example at the bottom of this slide where you see different variations of one word, so in different lines of this inscription. So if you see that the Parthian and the Middle Persian are pretty much the same, so the same word is repeating, which is Bidaksh, which is the royal title, I would say. But I don't want to get to the details of what is a named entity. So this was actually not in the data set of the named entities that we extracted. But through this process, we could actually track different recordings of how this word was transcribed in the Greek version with reference to the line number. Yeah, and now back to Megan to talk about the descriptive translation studies and translation alignment. You muted, Megan.
There's always something. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Brilliant, thank you. So this is going to just kind of briefly go back to something Chiara was talking about with descriptive translation studies and equivalence, just to explain a bit better about how we can maybe investigate these processes more and tease them apart. So the goal of descriptive translation studies, or DTS, is to reconstruct the actual process of translation. And alignment can help with this by identifying which input, i.e. which part of the source text, yields which output, which part of the translation. It's then possible to interrogate the process by which one transforms the other in order to interrogate the nature of their equivalence. equivalence, as Chiara explained beautifully, is really a thorny concept because true equivalence generally doesn't exist, and really equivalence is based upon interpretation, which is necessarily subjective. So this means that every translator formulates their own version of equivalence, which in turn can give us insight into what their specific priorities are. For example, do they prioritize fidelity to the source? Or do they prioritize how acceptable the translation is to the target culture? And is this always their priority, or is it dependent on other factors such as content, genre, pragmatic type, and audience? Answers to these questions provide insight into why these translators decided to translate their text in the first place. For example, are they looking to displace the original text, or are they interested in preserving it and popularizing it? Or is it sometimes a mixture of both? Furthermore, this information can aid us in identifying cultural equivalents, or words that share the same cultural function between languages, which can be used in turn to reverse engineer cultural contexts. So as this diagram from Tori kind of shows, cultural concerns dictate the linguistic realization of a translation, which then selects the appropriate translation strategies. So we can use translation alignment to kind of go back up this tree, kind of reverse the process to figure out exactly what those original cultural concerns were. And now I'm just going to briefly present a quick example of how this was done in an actual research project. If you saw the previous lecture on text analysis, you're going to remember that I briefly introduced this text, the Aeneados, which is a late medieval Scottish translation of the Aeneid. This text is notable not only for being the first full direct translation of the Aeneid in the British Isles, but also for its almost modern commitment to accurately translating the text, which was really, really unusual for the time. This text is also fascinating because it contains a prologue where the translator muses and comments on some of the difficulties he faced while translating. And one of the most interesting statements he makes is that he doesn't translate word for word, which many tend to take at face value just because this translation is extremely long and sometimes people don't feel like wading through it all. However, by using translation alignment tools, we can actually test this statement of his and see if he's being totally truthful. So I initially aligned the Aeneados to the Aeneid by line in response to Douglas's claim they didn't translate word for word. I also did this because the line is an established poetic unit, so it was a fair bet that it would be something recognized and respected by the translator. And also the tool I used, AntPconc, works best on lines. So AntPconc is part of the AntConc family. It's a parallel concordancer that is free to download and use. A concordancer is a tool used to search texts and generate statistics about word frequency and tagging. A parallel concordancer can do this across two aligned texts. AntPconc requires manual alignment, and its means of aligning are quite crude. It tends to want aligned content to kind of sit on the same line across documents, so it's a bit like an Excel spreadsheet, to be honest. However, it's really easy to download and use, so it's useful for initial exploration and experimentation. If you want more information about how to use it, you should check out the video we made on text alignment last year as part of the previous SunoikisIS program. And that included some tutorials on both Ugarit and AntPconc. But anyway, this approach yielded some interesting results. One of the biggest findings is that the amount of original content that Douglas adds to his translation significantly increases over the course of the text, which indicates that the mode of translation this translator uses changes. It also suggests that the translator translated the Aeneid in book order and probably didn't revise the text significantly, which tallies quite well with what we know about how long it took for him to write the translation. He says he did it in, I think, just over 15 months or just under 15 months, something like that. So he did it quite quickly. The fact that line alignment works so well is proof that Douglas attached special significance to Virgil's lines as a poetic structure. as well as to other layout structures such as page breaks in his source. Indeed, some of his more awkward translations seem to be motivated by page breaks. It seems quite likely that Douglas's changing translation mode was motivated in part by the changing layout in his source text, which impacted how he read the poem. So that's all great, but this doesn't actually answer the question of, does Douglas translate word by word? We know he structures his poems around lines, but we can also see that his translation is also lexically sensitive. So what I'm currently working on is I'm trying to produce a word alignment now in Ugarit to further evaluate Douglas's comments. So far, I've not done too much. I've only completed the first chapter of book 1, but the results reveal a very high percentage, which you can see actually on the figure to the right. The figure on the left is the results of line alignment. The figure on the right is the results of word alignment. But we have a very high percentage of one-to-one translation pairs, as well as a high percentage of one-to-many. And this may indicate that Douglas adopts something closer to word-for-word translation than his comments suggest. Of course, it's not yet conclusive, and we can probably expect to see a change in these statistics over the course of the translation, like we did with line alignment. But it'll be interesting to see if the number of one-to-one translation pairs goes up or down. And if the high percentage is maintained across the translation, this might imply that Douglas is not being wholly truthful or self-aware when he describes his translation as not word for word. Or perhaps he is making a distinction in how he conceptualizes word for word translation that escapes us and our modern perspective. In any case, either way reveals something interesting about Douglas's views on equivalence, which in turn can provide evidence about how translation was enacted in the Middle Ages. So the next thing we're going to talk about is reading texts and languages you don't know using translation alignment. And Farnoosh is going to take the floor on this one, really, as she has some really interesting data to share from a project she conducted. However, just as I did in the text analysis lecture, I first want to provide a historical example of this practice to help illustrate how translation alignment itself is not necessarily a new idea. Rather, the act of cross-referencing translations to access different languages is a foundational principle in comparative philology. So in the late 1500s and early 1600s, there was a kind of rediscovery, or rather a renewed interest in Anglo-Saxon language and literature. That was brought about partly by vernacular language movements that became much more invested in nationally defined languages and histories, and partly by the development of knowledge resources and methods through the study of classical languages, the rise of humanist scholarship. However, there was a general need for much of Old English to be reconstructed, as centuries of Norman influence had distanced early modern English speakers from the earlier variant of their language. Enter the English antiquary, William Lisle, who was a fellow at Cambridge. Lisle did important work on deciphering Old English, but he achieved this through a kind of three-way alignment between Latin, Scots, and Old English, using the Enneados, the text I've just discussed. So in his publication of an edition and translation of Alfric's work on the Old and New Testaments, he describes the challenges he faced in trying to understand Old English, how he first tried to approach the language via Dutch, but in the end found that the Enneados was the most helpful resource. At first, he describes that it was really hard to understand the dialect, because it was a lot closer to the original Saxon and further away from, his own more Norman influenced dialect. But because the text is such a close translation of the Latin, he was able to first use the Latin source to kind of understand and interpret the Scots. And then, because the Scots is so close to the Saxon, he was able to kind of reverse engineer through the individual etymons in Scots some of the meaning of similar items in Old English. So in this way, the accuracy of Douglas's translation, the very fact that it can be aligned on word level, played a really important role in early Germanic philology. Of course, this wasn't even the only occasion that the text was used in this way. So the early philologist Franciscus Junius used the Eneados in a similar way to disambiguate some of Chaucer's language and trace the evolution from Old English to Middle English. He also wrote a glossary of Gavin Douglas's more obscure vocabulary. Later, the scholar Thomas Rudiman created a new edition of the Eneados and likewise compiled a glossary of Douglas's language. And weirdly, he used Franciscus Junius to help him with this, but not the glossary that Junius had already created. Instead, he used Junius's work on Gothic, which again just goes to show the overlap that Douglas's work had with other languages. Again, partly due to just the very kind of etymological nature of Scots and its connection to languages like Norse and its closeness to Anglo-Saxon, and partly due to how, again, Douglas made it very easy for his text to be interread with Latin. And then finally, John Jameson used Rudiman's glossary of Douglas as the foundation for his own etymological dictionary of the Scottish language, which was the core text on the Scots language until about the 20th century. So in this way, we can see how Gavin Douglas's translation has been a foundational text for comparative linguistic work across at least 4 different languages, Latin, Scots, Old English, and Middle English, with potential applications in Gothic as well. And again, it seems, at least to me, that this usefulness in this context is derived by its very nature as a translation. It embodies 2 texts and at least 2 languages in one. And in effect, it acts as a kind of Rosetta Stone for English and related Germanic languages. And I'll hand over to Farnoosh. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Megan. I would like to continue by talking about the pedagogical applications of translation alignment for particularly teaching ancient Greek to Persian speakers. And I want to share results from 2 courses that I have taught in Persian, one Introduction to Homeric Greek, and the other translation course based on Plato's Crito. So after giving you an overview of the content of these 2 courses, I will talk about how we use alignment in these courses, and I think I find it useful to differentiate between different types of alignment that we used here. But first, I used a type of the guideline-based alignment for evaluation of the results of the translations of the participant, as well as comparing them to other translations. And there were also a lot of student-led alignments, and within the student-led alignments, there were occasions where participants were asked to align an already available translation, or they were asked to revise a translation for better alignment and then align it, or they were asked to actually translate a text and then align it to the original text. To the overview of the courses, the first course in this series was an Introduction to Homeric Greek, which was a rather short course, I would say. It was 20 sessions, and we had about 20 participants. And this course had no textbook, at least not in a conventional way. There were, of course, references to grammar books and a lot of digital annotations involved in this, and we basically try to make sense of the authentic text without any simplification of Homer, just through comparing different annotations together and afterward using alignment. And the second course was translation course based on Plato's Crito. And this was mostly a continuance of the Homeric course, because all 7 participants of this course had already participated in the Homeric Greek course. So they had just a bit understanding of the of Greek. In comparison, participants of the Homeric course had no prior knowledge. So we actually started the Homeric course with the writing system. And this course, this Crito course, was in 49 sessions, and there were 6 sessions afterwards where the translations that were produced through this course were revised. So generally, it had a similar approach to the Homeric course, but we also used a lot of available translations in English and German. So the general flow of each session was that participants would translate a certain chunk of the text from Greek to Persian using whatever annotations or resources they had available, lexicons, commentaries in any language that they wish to use, and then align it to the original Greek, so align the translation. And this course had one final goal. It was to provide a philological translation of Crito in Persian, meaning that a translation that would be very faithful in representing both the form and the content of the original Greek. But actually, it resulted into 3 final translations instead of 1, because there were interesting variations that we wanted to keep. But to actually, I think it would help to show the motivation behind this, why it was so important for all these participants to have a philological translation and to have this access to the original Greek. And I think giving some background information of the situation of Hellenic studies in Iran would help. So for that, let's take a look at available translations of these 2 texts that we used in these courses in Persian. So Iliad has almost 3 translations. I say almost because we have 2 indirect translations and 1 partial translation that is directly from Greek, and I produced that translation and aligned it at word level to the Greek text. And Crito has currently 5 translations. If you include the 3 translations produced in this course, it would be 8. But actually, when we started, there were only 4 indirect translations available. And then right after the Crito translation course finished, a new translation was published by Iman Shafibek in a bilingual edition with Greek on one side, and this was a wonderful opportunity for us because we could compare our results to this translation, and you can see some results from the guideline-based alignment that I did of all these translations of Crito. So one section. So the first 4 translations you see in this chart are the indirect ones, and the last 4 are the direct ones. The last 3 being results of the course. And when you look at the results, you see there are generally the indirect translations seems to be longer in Persian, and they have much more unaligned words both in Greek and Persian. And I did this alignment based on what I would assume are rather a flexible guidelines. So I would say that if we look at the alignments at the end of my talk, you see that there's like phrases that are not aligned because basically there is not much similarities between the content of the translation and the original Greek. So I will get back to this section and the alignments of it at the end. But right now, I want to actually talk about the starting point of the course in the Homeric Greek course. After only a few sessions, I would say 4 for this section exactly. Learners with very limited knowledge of ancient Greek who can basically read the alphabet, they know, for example, what noun declension is, and that's it, not much more. Were asked to align an available direct translation, and that was from my translation of the Iliad. And when we look at the accuracy rate, we see that they're done about like 90% of it is correct. There is about 1% incorrect where there is like no correlation in the meaning of the equivalence that they have chosen to pair. But what I find very interesting is that about 9% of it usually is partially correct. And when we look at each example, we see that there are many, many particles in this partially correct alignments. This is something I would like to call horror vacui of alignment. So at this point, participants assume that there is a 100% correlation between the text that they're given in Greek and the translation. So no word should be left unaligned. And if they are left with, at the end of the alignment, they're left with words that are unaligned, they try to align it with other words as much as possible. And as soon as they actually stop with this approach, you see a huge improvement in the number of correct alignments, because basically when we look at examples here, for example, you have the aligned, the first partially correct with two words in Persian. One is and, the other is ra, which is a marker, the object marker, and has nothing to do with the Greek word in any way, but it's aligned because because of horror vacui, I would say. So our next step was to ask the participants to align an indirect translation after revising it. So they were asked to revise the translation in a way that would align better with Greek. And when we look at the examples of what they have done, the main strategy in the translation seems to be that they try to go by a word-by-word translation. So to put an equivalent for each Greek word in Persian, and then try to align it in the same way to achieve the highest rate of like one-to-one pairs. And I find this also very interesting because there is a short period that this continues, and after a short while you see that they can actually leave words unaligned or just simply not translate the Greek words that they think is not easy to find an equivalent for in Persian. After the Homer course, we moved to the Crito translation course. And at the beginning of the Crito translation course, the students were asked to also revise indirect translations. I mentioned that we had 4 indirect translations of Crito in Persian. It was something that was available to them throughout the Crito course, but it seems that they never actually used those translations for revision. They just, on very, very a small number of occasions, consulted those translations to see how certain words were translated. Otherwise, there was such a gap in content between the indirect translations and the Greek text that it was basically of no use to them. So even with the final results of the Homer course, the one that I just showed you, it's difficult to draw a line where it's not a revision anymore and it's a translation. So I would say when we look at the examples, you can see that the participants have a very good understanding of the context of certain words, xenoi here being one example. I would say this is far behind what you can find in commentaries, even in English, in a sense that it doesn't give you the Persian equivalent that you would need, but it gives you the information that you would need to understand the text. So I've translated the equivalents that they have put in for this word xenos. And I've put in the dictionary entry at LSJ on the right side. I apologize, it is a bit too small to read. And I've translated their equivalents to English. So in the three final translations, we had the three first equivalents. So non-Athenian friend, outside friend, which is actually in Persian a coined word that I've tried to translate to English. And the third one, one participant didn't actually translate this word because it wasn't easy to find an equivalent for it. It's rather has a complex meaning. And he decided that it would be easier to just transliterate it and put footnotes on it instead of actually finding an equivalent for it in Persian. I also want to share another example, which I found interesting myself, because as I said, the guideline-based alignments were something that I used throughout this presentation, as well as for evaluation of the results of this course. And basically the participants were never obliged to use any guideline. The reason for me was that I didn't ask them because I assumed to use a guideline and to align, you have to have a good understanding of both languages that you're aligning to be able to follow a guideline. But when we look at details of after a short while, you see that there are trends in how each participant has aligned their translations, and there are actually interesting things happening within the way how they've aligned it. For example, in this case, the verbal aspect of an infinitive, which in the English you can see that in one case is to consider, and in one case is translated to have finished considering. In Persian, the first translation is translated as to consider beforehand, but she hasn't actually aligned the word beforehand to the Greek, but only to consider. So basically infinitive to infinitive. The second translation you see is translated as, I would translate it to English as finished considering. And everything is actually aligned to the Greek. So finished considering in Persian is aligned to the Greek infinitive. And I found it interesting that to actually put morphology, to emphasize the morphology in the first translation, and to follow that assumed guideline. It was an interesting example. So back to the first paragraph that I shared the graph on, where I compared the indirect translations with the direct ones. Here you see the results of the course with the two of the translations that resulted from the course, and the one in the middle is the translation that was published right after the course. And there you see that there are not many words left in unaligned, so the unaligned ones are being in red. And here is the indirect translations of the same section, where you see major parts of the text basically have no equivalent in the Greek. And the difference between these two texts, I think, is quite prominent in a way that when you read the text itself, also not but not how they are translated, but actually the details of how they have aligned it is much more precise, I would say, and much closer to the goal, which was to provide a philological translation that would represent both the form and the content of the Greek. So now back to Chiara to explain some of the exercises that we suggest after this presentation.
Thank you, Farnoosh. So at the end of this session, we are going to give you the opportunity to explore translation alignment in kind of two different ways. And both of them come from the angle of align a text and try to test yourself in approaching a language or an alphabet that you're not familiar with and see how far you can get. These are two separate, very different options, and you can decide neither of them is more difficult than the other necessarily. It just depends on what you would like to do and how in depth you would like to analyze text. So in option one, this is fairly straightforward. Basically, try to select a text in a language that you do not know very well or at all. You should select a portion of a text. If you don't know any ancient Greek, it can be ancient Greek. If you don't know any Persian, Old English, whatever it is, if you have it accessible in a TXT format, you can use it. And you will need a translation of that text in a language that you do know very well. So for example, English. We have provided a few TXT versions of texts and their translations in the code folder of the Sunookisis session page. So you will find that link also in the explanation of the exercise in the session page. And the advantage of using those texts in particular is that we have also provide already aligned versions of those texts. So you can actually double check on your work at the end. But you do not have to use those texts necessarily, because the goal of these exercises is actually to reflect upon the operation of alignment, not necessarily to come up with a perfect aligned text. So in the first variation of the exercise, you can copy paste those texts in Ugarit and figure out where to go from there. In the course of this session, you have seen that there are several different types of approaches to alignment. So Megan talked plenty about aligning different chunks, right? Different sentences or different lines, different units of sense. So you may start from there. For example, if you have selected a text in poetry, this may be relatively easy. If you have selected a text in prose, you may use punctuation, for example, to help yourself try to recognize overlaps in bigger chunks. So if there is an actual alignment that you can leverage on in terms of sentences or in terms of line. And you can use a spreadsheet, for example, to record those alignments. Then you can start aligning word by word using Ugarit. And you can leverage on certain things that may be easier to recognize. For example, Farnoosh talked about aligning proper nouns like names of people and places, which maybe will be similar across a text and its translation. Then you can start from there and you can use them as anchors to try to see if you recognize other words around them that can be aligned between the two texts. And you can proceed from there, right? You can go from bigger chunks of text, like expressions or sentences, and you can increase the granularity as you go. See if you recognize, for example, frequently repeated words like conjunctions, adverbs, and things like that. And just see how far you can get with this sort of scaffolded approach. At the end, think about what level of granularity you were able to achieve without having to necessarily rely on external resources like the dictionaries or things like that. Were you able to achieve a word-by-word alignment? Did you stop at the line? Did you stop at the paragraph or chunk level? And why do you think that is? How difficult was it to go from a larger, a less fine granularity into a finer level of alignment? What sorts of context clues were you able to use, and did they work? Were names always translated in the same way? where adverbs and conjunctions always present in the translation, and so on and so forth. And then finally, was there a perfect overlap that you were able to recognize in the words that you were able to align? See if you can use a dictionary, assess whether the dictionary actually helped you, whether it revealed perfect overlap or not, and see how you can go from there. See how much you understood of that text that you didn't know very well at the beginning. In option two, in a way, it's slightly more challenging because we invite you to actually select a text in a language and an alphabet that you do not know. So this can be ancient Greek, it can be Arabic, it can be Persian, it can be Chinese, it can be whatever you want, provided that it's not only the language, but also the alphabet and the script that you do not know. You can use some of the text that we have provided in the session page, or you can select them from any other online repository or online edition. You need to have a translation of that text, of course, in order to do this exercise. So initially, do not use Ugarit. Actually use ChatGPT or another generative AI tool. Paste the text chunk by chunk or line by line into ChatGPT and use the following prompt. Ask ChatGPT to transliterate the sentence in the original language and ask ChatGPT to provide the meaning of each word. We have added an explicit prompt for ChatGPT not to translate the sentence in full because you don't want that much help, but you do actually want a general sense of what each word means and how it can be transliterated. And of course, be aware that ChatGPT may not work super, super well with certain languages. And then use this as a support to create a word-by-word alignment of your text against a scholarly translation in Ugarit. So you can, after you have done this sort of experiment to get a better sense of what the text means, what each word means, use that information to perform an actual word-by-word alignment on Ugarit. And my invitation is actually to use a scholarly translation of that text. So for example, if you've been using an ancient Greek word, search for a translation by a scholar, search for an edition by a scholar of that particular Greek work. And just compare, try to figure out if the vocabulary provided by ChatGPT was sufficiently precise to allow you to perform a word-by-word alignment against a scholarly translation. Try to assess where the basic meanings provided by ChatGPT diverge from the scholarly translation. Try to reflect on why that is. And if there was any situation where ChatGPT was actually not helpful and that the scholarly translation did something entirely different, try to understand why that is and try to challenge yourself with that. So these are the two options. Again, neither of them is inherently more difficult. They just want to invite you to use these tools to approach a text in a language or in a script that you do not actually know very well, and see how far you can get and reflect upon the different dynamics of using alignment for an exercise like this. So I will thank you very much, and I will welcome any questions for myself, for Farnoosh, and for Megan, of course.
And I guess a reminder to people who've been following this program that finding the text and making sure you have a clean TXT of the text are things that we covered early in this semester, and so that it's an opportunity to practice those skills, and yeah, we're much more interested in you being critical about the results you get from this than we are in either you're being excuse me, very, very good at using the tool or very, very good at translating a language accurately. So don't feel like you're going to do better if you cheat and choose a language you know better than Chiara has suggested you do, because we really want you to be critical about this rather than just come along and look clever. That's just a suggestion. And yes, anybody who does have questions, this is the moment to post them into the live chat.
Gabby, do you want me to stop sharing?
No, don't. I can
okay.
I can just switch to this screen. Yeah, one thing that that I've found students in some previous years have had the sort of temptation to do is to look at their alignment in something like Ugarit, and they see the green and red percentages in the bar underneath the screen, and they've made an explicit association between the more green there is on that bar, the higher number of aligned words. Therefore, it is, and I quote, a better translation. I hope from today's session that it's clear that would be a really naive thing to say. But I don't know if anyone wanted to add to that, or if that's just too obvious to even mention.
But Megan, you're muted.
Yet again, sorry. One day I will learn. I was going to say I completely agree that it's that's a naive way to interpret that bar. However, it still can tell you something interesting, because it's still kind of a kind of way of measuring exactly how the translation is being conducted, so that if you have a translation where you can more easily match up, most of the text, most of the translation with its source, that does tell you something about what the translator was trying to do, that maybe they also had this kind of desire to represent every single aspect of the text that they could, which the translator I was talking about does do, which is really quite fascinating. But then likewise, it's not, you shouldn't expect that from every translator, because there will be loads who don't do that, but it tells you something at least.
So it does. The percentage of green you get on your percentage of aligned words bar may tell you something about the number of words that are one-to-one translated in the translation that you're working on, but it may also tell you something about the strategy of the alignment. Right? If I've gone through and I've aligned only exact translated words, so I only translate the noun to the noun, and I leave out all of the function words in English which are embedded in the noun in the Greek, then I'll end up with a very small percentage of aligned words. Whereas if I say, okay, of the army is 3 words in English, but I align them all to this one genitive in Greek, that would mean I'll end up with an almost 100% alignment, and that's nothing to do with the translation. Right, and so there's 100 reasons why those green bars tell you all sorts of things, but they may tell you something about the alignment, they may tell you something about the translation, they may tell you something about the translation strategy, they may tell you how far you got through it. Maybe you only got halfway through. There's all sorts of things that they tell you there. And a close translation is not necessarily the same as a good translation. I mean, there's all these reasons why that sentence is not a useful sentence to say. By no means was I suggesting that means ignore the green bar. It can be a really useful thing. I mean, even if it's only a reminder that you haven't finished.
If I can add something, the green bar is also really any quantitative measure, not just the green bar, is it should never be used on its own. Like any quantitative measure, it can give you a glimpse into something, but it should always be used together with other quantitative or qualitative measures. So for example, the green bar can be useful if you're actually adopting a comparative approach, for instance, where either you have a benchmark of what percentage you're looking for, or you have several different instances of the same translation, of different translations of the same text, where you can get a sense of what is going on if you know that there is a consistent underlying alignment strategy beneath the alignments, but there's a deep dependence on the contextual strategy in there, and the underlying operations in the alignment that needs to be considered. Again, it's useful at a glance, but it needs to be accompanied to other things, other indicators.
And it can be something that you can use as a preliminary, if you've aligned 20 different verses and each one has a different scale, glancing through them and seeing, well, one of them suddenly has much more red than all the others.
That's
That
right.
doesn't necessarily tell you anything, but it gives you something to look at. And I guess if the left-hand bar has much more green in it than the right-hand bar, that also tells you something. I'm not quite sure what. I'm trying to visualize that, but those sorts of almost all the Greek words are represented in the Persian text, but half the Persian words are not represented in the Greek text. For example, there's all sorts of that could be a very different information about the translation.
If I can also add something, I think it also really depends on the guideline. For example, the guidelines that I used for the last alignments that I showed was very similar to the guidelines that Chiara and I developed for Greek English. And in those guidelines, we don't align punctuation. And although you see, there is basically there is almost no voice left unaligned in Greek or Persian. Still, you have 30% unaligned, and that's just punctuation. And it's in that sense, even in situations when you have a translation that is really representing the Greek text, simply because of some a line in the guideline that says we don't align punctuation, you have a high unaligned percentage.
Yeah, I was going to say there is a huge debate around what do we do with punctuation when it comes to alignment, and it's really a choice that depends on, of course, what you want to do. We also need to be aware of the fact that in ancient texts, the punctuation that we see is editorial. It's not a feature of the way in which the text was transmitted in its original context. So there are of course different approaches to that. Do we align punctuation? Do we not? Because both things can actually tell you something. The approach that we did have, as Farnoosh was saying, in defining alignment guidelines, it could be as close to lexical alignment as possible, was not to align punctuation, because when you get into automatic processing of the output, that can introduce noise. I will say that. But of course, there may be different approaches. And for example, in the study of medieval translations, for instance, it may be a productive approach to also include punctuation that is originally attested in the text.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Gabby. I was just going to say I have an example of that, where the source text that Gavin Douglas uses for his translation is really interesting, because it would have been a brand spanking new edition at the time of the Aeneid, and considered really cutting edge, because the editor had gone through and added all of his own punctuation. And when I conduct the alignment, you can see that Gavin Douglas uses this punctuation as a guide for figuring out where the clauses are, and he responds to it very much. The only problem is you still can't align the punctuation between the two texts, because we're dealing with an edited version of the medieval translation, because it doesn't really have very clear punctuation. So it's one of those things where alignment would be useful, but I'm not quite sure how it would be done, because it's more of a kind of grammatical thing happening between the two texts.
Yeah, and there are some cases where you might want to line up punctuation in one translation with things that are part of the text in another language. So thinking of things like the particle ara in Greek that introduces a question obviously you wouldn't translate that in English, but you'd put a question mark as the punctuation. So if you were really wanted to align everything in Greek, you'd want to you'd use the punctuation as the thing to align it to. And in Hittite, there's a particle that goes at the start of a clause that's direct speech, that's not used consistently, but when it is, it's equivalent to the quotation marks that you put in a text in English. So what's done with all of these particles in some languages are things that one of the ways you might indicate in a translation is through punctuation. So that makes it even more complicated.
Yeah, that's very, very, very similar to the example I was going to give, which is it's fairly uncommon in translation alignment, but it's actually very, very common in tree banking, which we'll discuss next week, which is where a comma serves as a conjunction in the sentence, right? And that's something that is going to be translated differently potentially, and therefore you might want to align a comma to the word and or something like that. A colon to the word namely, all sorts of things that you might do differently in translations. Not to mention in modern poetry, where they can do all sorts of fun things with, punctuation as sort of almost emoji-like functions of punctuation shapes and things like that. That could have all sorts of idiosyncratic translations.
I mean, I will say something about the sort of editorial character of our text. Speakers' names in drama or in dialogue, those are they're kind of a problem in my opinion, because they are editorial, but at the same time they are names, and they in automatic approaches they will introduce noise, because obviously a speaker's name is going to be the same between any sort of version of the text, or at least we hope. But at the same time, that may be a sort of information that you may want to have if you are, for example, if there are funky things happening with the ways in which different speakers are assigned different lines. So that's one of the things where the distinction between what is editorial, what is transmitted, what is quote unquote original is again a little bit problematic, and it's one of those instances where a qualitative approach sometimes clashes with a quantitative one, because the choices that you make in one sense or the other are going to affect the alternative option regardless of what you do. So you must be very, very careful once you have made your choice in understanding how that is going to affect for example, strategies where your task is to count words. So really, the thing is, when you create your aligned corpus, be very aware of the principles and the reasons why you have done certain things, because those are going to affect the data that you will get at the end. And you cannot make absolute considerations. You cannot just look at the numbers without context, because there's a reason why you come up with those numbers. And so you need to be aware. This is part of the reason why we came up with guidelines, but still, guidelines can't fix everything.
And will be used in certain contexts and not in others anyway.
Exactly. I want to mention that if you want to check out all of the guidelines in the various languages, if you feel like this is something that's useful to you.
Chiara, you muted.
Sorry. I want to mention that if you want to check out the various alignment guidelines that we have been mentioning, Farnoosh has mentioned the Persian ones, but there's a whole army of little alignment guidelines that you can see in Ugarit. If you click on the menu bar, there's a section that's called alignment guidelines, and you're going to be able to see all of the different options that we have collected or have published in various ways. And they are there for for supporting different types of alignment tasks. And of course, you can come up with your own.
When it comes to guidelines, usually it's the case that well, the end is basically justified. So the end justifies the means. So what you want to achieve is what you want to have in the guideline. So it's basically you decide what you want to have as the results, and that's based on that you write the guideline.
Yeah, for instance, I mean, one of the questions that we typically get in these sessions is if it is possible to align things that technically do not overlap. So actually things are not equivalent with one another, because sometimes you want to do that. Sometimes you have an interest in extracting data where there is actually lack of equivalence, but you want to make sure that you can count those occurrences, you can do stuff with them. And so how do you approach that in a setting where, at least from the outside, it looks like the guiding principle is equivalence? And that, again, it depends on what you want to do, and it depends on what your purpose, what your goal is with the project. I generally say that you can actually do whatever you want. You can align whatever you want, provided that you provide a clear disclaimer in the metadata about what you're doing, because there's a public corpus out there that is being used for different things. And so when you're doing something like this, it's important to clarify that in the project description. But as long as there is clear metadata about the purpose of the project, then that's totally fine. This is a tool, and it can be used in many different ways.
Cool, that's a good observation. I was going to mention a very, very loose alignment that I have in my dashboard on Ugarit, which I won't show now, but I may show next week to my to our class. That's an alignment of a translation of a pop song, right? So it's a very different kind of translation. It makes no attempt to be a literal translation. Not a single line is a literal translation of another line, but there are some very clear echoes across them. They're very clear, some of the same concepts. So where there's a concept that's clearly drawing on an equivalent in the source text, I mark that as an alignment. I'm now going to go into Ugarit and add some metadata saying that's what I've done, because as you suggested, but because yeah, it's a very odd to sometimes see things aligned that are yeah.
I mean, from the technical standpoint, from the technical standpoint, one of the things that we've always wanted to do with Ugarit, and that we hope to be able to do in the future, is to allow annotators to add specific labels to mark, because currently we mark the links in quantitative terms, right? One-to-one, one-to-many, and so on. But there is a qualitative labeling that can be attached to a link. So a fluent translation is a very different thing than a literal translation, and so on. So that's one implementation that we hope to pitch at some point in to funding bodies and things like that for improving the infrastructure. At that point, of course, it becomes a matter of how do you define the labels? What is the actual equivalence vocabulary that you're going to use in order to mark those instances appropriately? And this gets into the very, very complicated matter of semantics and vocabulary and ontology and so on, which we don't have the time to explore. But of course, that is a feature that, in my opinion, is necessary for us to add to the platform eventually.
Yeah, I mean, it might be nice to have features like a checkbox to say ignore punctuation from both stats and alignment options, so you don't accidentally click on a comma while you're trying to align a forward phrase, that sort of thing. Just to turn those things off. Yeah.
There are all sorts of things that should be done better, and even tokenization is a problem, still a problem for certain languages that at the moment don't have the support that that would be necessary to do something like this. So again, NLP infrastructure, low resource languages, and the like.
Yeah, another checkbox to say ignore brackets when you're tokenizing would be great for when you're trying to align an inscription. You end up with 9 tokens because there's square brackets in my text. That would be. But yes, we're making kind suggestions, not complaining that all the Herculean work that's gone into building this wasn't done.
No, we make use of them.
My very niche needs, were omitted from those.
We make good use of the feedback.
Glorious work. I mean, this is beautiful. So, yeah. I've added a disclaimer to my translation in Ugarit. My alignment plans, not my translation.
I mean, again, the reason why we ask people to do that is just because the corpus is used for other things. So we use it to train the automatic translation alignment model, and so on and so forth. Again, we do select the subset of the corpus that is not noisy to train the model, but of course having metadata explaining without us having the need to go back into the alignment and manually check is of course a very welcome help. And there are other people too who may be using these alignments, because again, if you do not toggle the visibility option, those things are public, and people can download the translation pairs and they can do things with them. So just for people to be aware, no pressure, but people should be aware that when they put something on the internet, especially on a website like Ugarit, which is actually fairly used and has a pretty good user base, people are going to see your stuff, and somebody may even find it useful. So actually, many people will find it useful. So it's important to understand the implications of that.
By the same token, nobody is going to look at it and mock you for aligning to
no.
Right? So
they will be very grateful.
Yeah.
They will be very grateful. Everybody is very, very grateful that people are putting this stuff out there, and they will not judge you at all. But of course, this is the reason why metadata is important, because you let other people know why this thing is out in the world and what you're doing with it. And it protects you as well. If you're doing this for research, you're preventing people from doing the same thing at the same time. And you may create nice collaborations, you may exchange knowledge, and so on.
Yeah, and perhaps that note of like collaboration is quite a nice place to finish on, in terms of like Ugarit being something that works on crowdsourcing and everybody contributing their data. So yeah, thank you very much, Chiara and Farnoosh and Megan, for contributing to this session. It's been super fascinating. Next week we have the final, in fact, 2 sessions of this Sunoikisis series. So on Tuesday, the 18th of March at 3 o'clock London time, we have the postponed 3rd session, which is working with Egyptian texts, which I think will in fact also include some translation alignment, talking about the Rosetta Stone. And then on Thursday, the 20th of March at 4 p.m. London time, we have papyrological texts and linguistic research, so talking about some annotated editions of papyri and tree banking and things like that. So yeah, thank you very much, everybody, and hopefully see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Fantastic
you.
stuff.
Thank you.